Thank you for coming this afternoon. My name is Viviana Fernandez. I am Associate Director at the Human Rights Research and Education Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon. For those of you who are part of the Women's Human Rights Institute program this afternoon, and for those who came especially for this event. We are extremely happy to partner today with the Women's Human Rights Institute, as mentioned, as well as the Colectiva Ixpop and Ontario Native Women's Association, who have been a big part of the creation of this conversation that I'm sure we will all enjoy very much. As it is customary at the University of Ottawa, we would like to begin with an Indigenous affirmation to welcome us all and put us all in a place of good acknowledging where we are and why are we here. So I will just proceed and then give the floor to Amanda Dale, who is a fellow of our Human Rights Research and Education Center. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. It is my pleasure then to give the floor to Amanda. We don't want to take too much time because we want to leave as much time as possible for this conversation. Thank you.
So much, Viviana. Welcome, everyone. The name of this symposium or discussion is What's Law Got to Do with It? Which is, I think, a beautiful title for something in the middle of a law school. And this is an assemblage of activists and UN experts using international human rights mechanisms to combat gender-based violence. So, first of all, who are we at the Women's Human Rights Institute, and why have we picked this topic? So the Women's Human Rights Institute is a small but mighty force that works globally to promote women's international human rights. And we were founded by Alda Facio, who is with us this evening, and Angela Lytle, who's running around making sure everything actually happens, is the glue behind the scenes and also the education expert that makes sure that the trajectory of our institute's learning experiences actually follow some kind of logical pattern, because most of us just aren't all that logical. Since 2004, we have been building the capacity of women's human rights defenders to take leadership roles and create change locally, nationally, and internationally. And we are running an institute this week in partnership with the Human Rights Research and Education Center here at the University of Ottawa, but we've held similar institutes all over the world. And this is, in fact, our 20th anniversary. For any of you who work for small nonprofits that are mostly volunteer run, you know that everything's held together with spit, glue, passion, rage, despair, and then more passion. That's how we're run. And who are we? We are activists, we're UN special procedures, we're CEDAW experts, CEDAW being the Convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. We are lawyers, we're artists, we're social workers, we're educators, we're scholars, and general badasses. In the last 20 years, we think we've counted up that we have done probably 1,000, we've amplified more than 1,000 feminist voices globally. And we've shared our knowledge, and they've shared their knowledge with us in over 43 programs in over 9 countries. I think we're adding a country every year. So that's who we are. So why did we pick gender-based violence against women as the topic for this evening? It is, in fact, the origin of the recognition of women's international human rights. The mechanisms were not specifically set up at the UN to recognize the forms of violence that make up women's human rights violations. And it was the activism of people like Alda Facio in particular that brought the issue of gender-based violence forward. Remember, for those of you who are Canadian, it was around the time that the CEDAW Declaration was ratified in the early 1980s, so 1981, it was ratified by Canada. Around this time, a female MP was laughed at openly in Parliament for raising the issue of wife battering. So this is an issue that only very recently has entered the canon of human rights protections. And it's because of women's activism. It is also now recognized as a global pandemic. This is before COVID. The WHO recognized that there was a global pandemic of violence against women and girls in 2013 in a report that has started to get a little more traction. So that's why we picked this focus for the institute that we did this week with all of our participants from around the world. And we thought tonight is a good night for us to have that discussion and open it up more publicly. And we have not only the founder of the Women's Human Rights Institute here to help guide that discussion, we also have a sitting member of the CEDAW committee, and we have the CEO of the Ontario Native Women's Network and a collective member from Ixpop, which is an Indigenous women's organization in Guatemala that's been very active in CEDAW. So I'm a fella, as I like to say, at the Women's Human Rights Center. Sorry, at the Human Rights Research and Education Center here at the University of Ottawa, and I'm a faculty member, friend, and all-round dog's body table moving person for the Women's Human Rights Center. And I'm just going to moderate this evening's discussion, although some of you who know me, I might have an opinion or two now and then. So I want to start not by giving long bios, because that's really a dull way to start your introduction to someone, but to get to know them a little bit through conversation. So the bios are available on our website. You've probably read them to come here tonight. And Marion, I want to turn to you first. You're like, what? Marion.
I'm here.
So Marion, you have so many facets to you. You're an attorney, you're a poet, you're an essayist, you're a filmmaker, you're a human and gender rights activist, and you're the representative from the Bahamas on the CEDAW committee, which is the committee of experts that interprets the treaty.
Correct.
So what made you run for membership on the committee of experts that interprets that work?
Well, I'll do my best. I'm really, really pleased to be here with Alda, Asio, and you, Amanda, and Sarah, and Cora, and all of our WHR alumni and participants, and our guests. So I'm from the Bahamas, and I sit on the CEDAW committee. And I'm also a part of a sub-region called the Caribbean Community. So I've been, so my sitting on the CEDAW committee comes from that sub-region of the Caribbean Community. So coming from the Bahamas in particular, we've had a long history of a constitution that has entrenched sex discrimination, and it largely operates against women in the Bahamas. And therefore, it also entrenches inequality between women and men. And this manifests itself largely at the constitutional level, in any case, in regard to women in the Bahamas being able to transfer their citizenship to their children in certain circumstances, unlike men who can do this in every circumstance. And so what I have come to understand is that this sex-based discrimination and inequality entrenched in the Constitution, which is the pinnacle of our legal architecture, also opens the door for gender discrimination in terms of gender-based violence, in terms of employment and other areas of our social and public life. So it is not just relegated to the issue of nationality transfer. And so over the past 10 years, 15 years, we've had 2 referenda in the Bahamas to overturn the entrenched provisions of the Constitution in regard to this inequality and discrimination against women. And we've had 2 resounding failures. The Bahamas community, population, by people, have voted against gender inequality twice. So this happened in 2009 and then again in 2017. I then was asked, during this period, I was asked by the Bahamas government to stand for election for the CEDAW committee. And I felt very strongly about this because I had been advocating for gender equality and removing the provisions from the constitutional referendum, which failed twice. I had also been an advocate for about 30 years in the Bahamas on reproductive rights, gender-based violence, and throughout the Caribbean and in other international arenas also. So I was selected, let's say, to stand for election by the government of the Bahamas. And that meant being nominated to the United Nations to stand for the election, which took place in June of 2016. Fortunately, I was elected from the General Assembly voters who would have attended the session at that time. And I became a member of the CEDAW committee during my first term in January 2017. So I was really, I think this issue of our referendum, our constitution entrenching these provisions that CEDAW is about, trying to remove discrimination and enact equality between women and men, that really cemented the deal for me in regard to running for the CEDAW committee. And so since then, I've been working in the Bahamas and throughout the Caribbean on issues of gender-based violence. And we still have a lot of challenges in the Bahamas itself in terms of the gender-based violence issue and how the Constitution, in my view, actually permits this kind of violation to happen with persons, with women and girls in particular. So that is my journey towards being on the CEDAW committee. This is my second term, so I will have spent 8 years on the committee, and I demit office in October of this year, alas, because I've really enjoyed the time and the work that I do, and but the work will continue in other ways.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you turn that one off? One mic on at a time, so it's a little bit of a dance up here. So thank you for that, Marion. I'm thinking about the sex discrimination in the Indian Act that also you have taken up in community, Cora. So we might come back to that when we get into further discussion. And there's more I want to ask you also about the rates of violence in the region. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But to make sure that everyone in the room knows who we're speaking with, I'd like now to talk to you, Sarah. I understand from Angela that you have a history of being the queen, the indigenous queen in Guatemala, and that you radicalized person and subsequently became someone who engaged directly with the CEDAW committee and its interpretations of indigenous women's rights, and had a profound effect on that interpretation. And I know that for a lot of people, things at the UN seem very far away, they're very remote. And I imagine in community, it would be hard to make the argument that this was relevant. So I'm very interested in what makes these international rights for women come alive for you, and how did you take up that role that you had in making them more explicitly for Indigenous women globally?
Buena tarde para todas. Es un placer poder compartir con todas ustedes, principalmente con este panel que tenemos acá. Hablé en mi idioma cachiquel porque para los pueblos indígenas de Guatemala el poder hablar nuestro idioma también es un posicionamiento político y pues lo quise hacer de esta forma. En relación a la pregunta, me parece muy importante de cómo a las mujeres indígenas en algunos momentos pues se nos ha utilizado más como un folclore, ¿verdad? Como esa exotización de nuestros pueblos. Sin embargo, pues nosotras también somos seres políticos, somos seres que podemos aportar también a nuestra sociedad. Existen muchas prácticas en nuestros pueblos que probablemente no lo podemos cambiar, pero sí lo podemos transformar. Y a partir de esta transformación que nosotras queremos hacer como mujeres jóvenes, como mujeres indígenas, empezamos a hacer ejercicios principalmente para analizar estos mecanismos internacionales que pueden servir como una herramienta más para poder posicionar esas problemáticas que vivimos en nuestros territorios. Justamente pues en ese año yo conocí a Alda en el año 2010 en México y compartimos como muchas experiencias relacionadas a los pueblos indígenas. El instituto como tal me permitió poder estar en un espacio para poder conocer más sobre la CEDAW y esto mismo permitió a que yo pudiera hacer también ejercicios en mi territorio, ejercicios en Guatemala junto con varias organizaciones de mujeres y de pueblos indígenas, principalmente la Asociación Mayaucush B, el equipo de estudios comunitarios y acción psicosocial, Jazz Mesoamérica, y también TICNAOG. Con ellas empezamos a trabajar para que nos podamos reunir como mujeres de varios países e identificar también problemáticas, ¿verdad?, que son estructurales para los pueblos indígenas. Y encontramos como un mecanismo internacional y estratégico la CEDAW para poder hacer visible estas problemáticas. Y es por eso que empezamos a impulsar la importancia de que se pudiera posicionar este tema a través de una recomendación general que hable explícitamente de esas violaciones a nuestros derechos como mujeres y niñas indígenas. Nos llevó muchísimos años, aproximadamente 9, 10 años, para que realmente esto fuera una realidad. En el año 2022, finalmente el comité de la CEDAW pudo aprobar pues esta recomendación general. Fue bastante importante para nosotras ver de cómo una semilla que nace en Guatemala se fuera expandiendo a los diferentes continentes. Actualmente vemos de que muchas organizaciones, muchas mujeres de varios territorios hablan de esta recomendación general y esta ha sido como una de las razones por las cuales pues la colectiva Ixpop ha funcionado. Queremos que más mujeres puedan reconocer sus derechos, que más mujeres tengan acceso también a la información, que conozcan sobre la CEDAW, que conozcan sobre estos mecanismos, que puedan saber de que hay herramientas que pueda fortalecer el ejercicio que ellas realizan en su comunidad, esa defensa de la madre tierra, que ellas también promueven una espiritualidad, que ellas tienen una identidad, que ellas tienen el derecho a hablar su idioma, ellas tienen su derecho también de fortalecerse en los territorios. Pero esto pues lo vamos sabiendo y conociendo a través también de diferentes mecanismos y que creo que esto nos ha reunido acá. También estoy muy consciente de ese papel que ha jugado el instituto, principalmente para apoyarnos de una forma estratégica, para también abrirnos puertas hacia estos mecanismos y principalmente Alda, ¿verdad?, por haber acompañado este proceso. Como Alda, hay muchas otras mujeres que han sido aliadas también de nosotras para poder conseguir pues esta incidencia a lo interno de Naciones Unidas. Casi siempre pues decimos que hay muchas barreras y principalmente ha sido el idioma para nosotras. Y como lo ven, pues yo no hablo el inglés, pero creemos que hay muchas otras razones por las cuales hacer incidencia y que esto no sea una barrera para las mujeres, para mujeres indígenas de las diferentes regiones, sino más bien sirva también para seguir posicionando nuestros derechos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm thinking of how you opened this evening in your own language, and how important it is to asserting the right to your own identity, to resist the erasure of your language, your culture, to assert it in public spaces, including at the UN, where we have many, many languages, but they're often not Indigenous languages. I want to thank you for your strength and for sharing that story with us tonight. And I'm going to ask you more about that. And I imagine, Cora, that we're going to have some things in common to talk about here. What is it about the international mechanisms that calls you to bring Indigenous women's experiences to those mechanisms? And what has it allowed you to advance and bring attention to?
Thank you, Miigwech. So I guess kind of heading into this space, I think there's a couple things coming to mind. I think first is, the teaching of humility, recognizing the leaders that have come before us as an organization, and recognizing your leadership in CEDA, and recognizing your leadership in the absolutely best document I've ever read, General Recommendation 39. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, highly recommend reading it. Really looking forward to where that advocacy goes into the future generations. And, for me within the organization, as we began to look at international advocacy as a tool, it is one tool. And we just really want to make sure that people know that international advocacy is an option, but it's one of many tools you should use strategically. And when we began to do the work, we needed to sit back in humility during our first times, just to sit and listen and observe and understand the process, because it's very complex, very complicated. Anybody's been on the UN website, and I've dove down that rabbit hole many times trying to figure out how do we activate this. And, going into the space, it was always about amplifying the voices of Indigenous women, our stories, our truths here in Canada, particularly here in Ontario, from the grassroots up. And so recognizing it's, women in community who are the experts, and we're here to amplify, what their truth is, what their recommendations are, what they want us to bring forward. And so during that first kind of year of learning this international space, and going to Geneva for the very first time, going to CEDA for the very first time, and seeing how fast everything moves, and that you really need to know your purpose for being there. You really, being Indigenous, for me, it's everything's like there's a purpose in life that I take very seriously, because I have a responsibility to honor my ancestors. And so for me, like my ancestors have passed on a prophecy: when Indigenous women take up their leadership roles once again in our communities will become whole and healthy and healing once again. And interestingly enough, as I'm sitting here tonight, another part of the prophecy is around that this learning and reclaiming leadership is going to take place in a box. And that was kind of the interpretation. And you think about what we're in now, we're in a box, right? Like looking at academia as learning in a box. And so there's that opportunity there. And so for me, there's that, that personal motivation, that purpose in life, and very fortunate to work in an organization where my purpose and the mandate of our organization aligns. And recognizing within the NGO forum for the Beijing Plus 30 platform, being there, we had planned to go in to listen and observe and watch and learn. And we realized very quickly how privileged this space is. So anybody here who decides to enter into this space, just be very, aware. It's a very privileged space. I had walked in and there was a Caucasian woman who wanted to speak on behalf of North America because of the regions you're talking about. The regions are kind of a little awkward. There's some of the regions, but just sitting there. And I think because there was so few Indigenous women in the space for the very first time, kudos to leadership because they really wanted to give space to Indigenous women to speak and to do an intervention. And so they had asked me if I would do the intervention. So I'm like, I'll jump in there if you want me to, of course. And then it became about how I was taken away. I, as an Indigenous woman, was discriminating against this Caucasian woman in that space. And so I went from like having my key message on what we were going to talk about and talking about violence against Indigenous women here in Canada and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the systemic racism that we're facing here in Canada, to suddenly like confronting so much privilege within the space and the fighting for voice, to being like, okay, this is not what I expected, right? I didn't expect to see the way women were reacting and responding in the room. And then you kind of take a bit of a step back and look, everybody's fighting for voice. Everybody's fighting for issues, and and it was because the system is structured as such. So anyway, I ended up, the anger you spoke about, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have to call out privilege in this space right now because they're not seeing it. They think saying intersectional lens or saying intersectionality is covering all of us in this room. It's covering them, and it's all mostly non-Indigenous women, Caucasian women taking up the majority of the space. So that's how I was like framing it around. I just want us to recognize the privilege that's sitting here, and that if you have privilege on the backs of Indigenous women and children, is that really privilege or is that oppression? And we can't leave no one behind, and then trying to build those relationships after, because they wanted to speak on behalf of Indigenous women, and they had their recommendations. So like, we have the recommendations. I said, who gave you the authority to have those recommendations? And they got together as a group and they said, what do Indigenous women need? And they came up with these kind of reports that they grabbed at, and they said the National Inquiry into Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls for justice. Like, that's what they wanted to pull in. And they said all those recommendations should be implemented. And so then I questioned them again, have you read those recommendations? And they said, no. I said, do you know that there's a mandatory minimum sentence in there? And what is that going to equal? It's going to equal more Indigenous people in the prison systems. And Indigenous women are already over 50% represented within the federal justice system. They're like, well, we didn't know that. I'm like, oh, I know, because you haven't engaged with Indigenous women. And that wouldn't be an Indigenous woman's recommendation to come forward on the floor. Our recommendations would be, how are we creating the space in these systems for Indigenous women to come together, to talk, to collaborate, to learn from each other, to be in relation with each other, to be in circle together. That's the recommendations we need to be looking at, is how we support each other. How are we in this system disrupting the system? That's what we have to do. We have to disrupt these systems and insert spaces. Because just stating intersectionality without really understanding and unpacking that, and that, we've asked Indigenous women when we've held side events, said, who represents you? And they've told us very clearly they represent themselves. And so how do we insert that, and how do we make space systemically within the UN system for Indigenous women? Because there is a uniqueness that we're seeing globally. Indigenous women are being discriminated against all across the globe. In Guatemala, we went to Rwanda for a Woman Deliver, and hearing from Indigenous women in all those countries, they all had the same voices, that their rights are being impacted legally because they are Indigenous and because they are women. And that's something that I think we're seeing, that's collective experience for Indigenous women around the globe.
Thank you so much, Cora. And yeah, that was one of the weirdest meetings I've ever been at. I have to agree with you on that. That was a strange meeting. And when I think about what the Women's Human Rights Institute is trying to do around bringing voices together and creating space, these are the kinds of conversations that bring us together to be able to work in allyship in these different contexts. And I'm thinking, you know, in terms of what you said, also, Cora, about the issues that need to come forward and how one time when you and I were on a call together in a discussion, you talked about the difference between having two canoes going in the same direction and making sure that one canoe is not so big that it tips the other canoe over or prevents it from going where it needs to go. And those are the discussions that we need to have in women's conversations with each other about how to advance leadership and have humility at the moments we need to step back and make space for the voices that need to be in the room, right? And I'm thinking, Marion, of something you talked about with us today in the Institute. And you talked about how women aren't speaking to each other about the kinds of violence that you know statistically are happening in the region. And yet there isn't the space in the dominant narrative for women to find places to say, hey, wait a minute, this statistic about violence is actually something that I know of in my family or in my friend group, and those moments of connection where we actually start personalizing how this is affecting us, that's when the radicalization starts happening. And I wondered if you wanted to reflect at all on that situation in your context in the Bahamas.
I had mentioned earlier that in the Bahamas and the Caribbean, we have a high prevalence of I shouldn't be touching it, right? Of gender-based violence against women in various forms. And in the Bahamas in particular, we have the highest rate per capita actually in the world, according to the World Health Organization, in regard to rape. And so I was saying that the women's communities to which I belong and women in general in the Bahamas, we live our lives every day, going to work, doing what we do. And we're not paying attention to this prevalence and the dangerous situation that we face every day in our community in terms of rape. And I was saying that there's a dissonance between what is actually happening and the lived experiences of women who are being sexually assaulted in various forms, and women in general in the Bahamas who either are not in tune with that or are just not paying attention to it. And so the question is, how is that environment possible when we see in the newspapers every day, and we know women every day who have been sexually assaulted and domestic violence that actually turns into murder? So these are, you know, things that happen often. And so the shock element of it happens, and we all, you know, jump up and say, oh my gosh, this is terrible. And you know, it is this evil person or dangerous man that has done it. But we don't make the connection that this is actually systematic, and a part of the culture in which we live. I think a part of the problem that, as I see it, is that we do not create the space for women in the Bahamas in particular to come together to have that kind of conversation of what it means to be living in this very dangerous environment that we all live in day and night. And a part of that is overshadowed, in my view, by what I would call the economic globalization kinds of trajectories that are the dominant part of the conversation. And so what I would call the political economy of the Bahamas, wherein this violence is enabled, is really the order of the day. And so we are more concerned about servicing a debt, a foreign debt. We're more concerned, for example, about the IMF calling us out on our defaults in our debt servicing than we are about our own personal security. And so this is the kind of issue that I think we need to really understand, and that is the global economy, the sort of the ways our countries govern themselves in terms of the kinds of laws that they put in place, the kinds of tax injustices that are there that really create environments for gender-based violence. And we're just not making those connections, those links. And
Yes.
so we do have to make that happen. And I'm one who really believes strongly that the human rights work that we do has to be seen through a historical lens, for one, and a political lens. It's not, human rights is not, it can't be abstracted from the history of the country in which we live or the region in which we live. And I often get the feeling, or I also often see that that is what happens. And so the human rights work is just seen as something independent of, let's say, the economy, the governance that we're all subjected to, whether it's, you know, democracy or militarization. All of these things are related, and we need to make those connections. And the increased kind of militarization that we see in the world is very much a part of what is happening in each of our domestic territories. And so the continuum is there, you know, from the violence in the family right through to schools, to employment places where we have sexual harassment, to the larger areas of conflict that we all are aware of in the world. And so I think we need space to really understand all of this, both at the very sort of individual personal level and how it affects us and how it affects us as a community. And so the space that you're talking about that is needed, Amanda, is something that I have felt very strongly about. And so the work that I do on the CEDAW committee has engendered for me a lot of tension, because I go to Geneva 3 times a year and I do the work at the international level. And I go back home and I'm experiencing a reality that's, a huge dissonance. And huge gaps in terms of the work that I'm engaged in, and just trying to make sure that I can parlay what I do internationally, locally, and vice versa. And so we need some space to do this kind of work.
I'm wondering if both of you would reflect on the particular situation of Indigenous women, in your case, Sarah, post-conflict, and trying to translate those rights into something that's tangible and that can make a difference, because I know that's what you've been doing to great success. And Cora, I know you also work very directly in community with women on what their rights are to be free from violence. And I know that this question in Canada is not militarization, but there is a lot of violence from police forces. And there has been, in the history of all of the work that the inquiry did, a lot of evidence about Indigenous women not being able to turn to police for protection. So I'm thinking about that combination and wondering if maybe, Sarah, we could start with you and Cora, go to you. So give each other lots of time so you can have your mediated discussion with each other with the headphones on.
Bueno, las mujeres indígenas, considero de todo, bueno, de los 90 países que tiene un registro en donde habemos mujeres indígenas, hemos pasado por diferentes eventualidades que afecta principalmente pues nuestros derechos individuales y colectivos, y que creo que compartimos como muchas de estas situaciones, ¿verdad? En Guatemala, pues recientemente hemos pasado un conflicto armado interno en donde las mujeres y las mujeres indígenas principalmente, pues han sido un botín de guerra, ¿verdad? Hablando de esto, es que, por ejemplo, las mujeres han sido víctimas y sobrevivientes de violencia sexual, muchas de ellas con hijos producto de esta violación. Hemos visto también de que muchas de ellas han intentado empezar a hablar de estas situaciones a pesar de que ya pasaron más de 30 años. Lamentablemente, en los juzgados esto no ha sido escuchado. Algunas mujeres, principalmente abuelas quienes han buscado justicia por estos hechos, han sido criminalizadas. Muchas de ellas pues no acceden a la justicia en su idioma. Lamentablemente, pues tampoco se ha juzgado todo el genocidio que ha pasado en Guatemala, y esto pues sigue afectando a estas nuevas generaciones porque no existe entonces un precedente en donde implique que esto no se vuelva a repetir. Desde esta situación es que también las mujeres seguimos resistiendo. Ha sido una lucha histórica esa resistencia que hemos tenido. Y es por eso que nos ven acá, es por eso que todavía estamos hablando de nuestros derechos en estos espacios. Considero que siempre hemos tenido ese legado de resistencia, de lucha, ¿verdad? De nuestras abuelas, de nuestras ancestras. También considero que es muy importante valorar todo ese trabajo que ellas han realizado porque han abierto brechas, han abierto camino para nosotras. Em, Considero también que es muy importante utilizar la CEDAW siempre para esa exigencia de los derechos. La CEDAW es un documento, es un mecanismo estratégico en donde podemos hacer elevar también esas voces y que de cómo también el comité puede escuchar, puede también hacer esas investigaciones, de cómo puede recomendarle a los estados para que estas realidades puedan cambiar. Existen realidades estructurales de las cuales pues seguramente es muy difícil irlas cambiando de un momento a otro, pero por eso estamos haciendo estos procesos para que más mujeres seamos conscientes de nuestros derechos, para que más mujeres podamos reconocer también que existen estrategias, que existen mecanismos en donde podemos como hacer esa exigencia. También considero que en Guatemala ha sido pues un territorio en donde a través de esa resistencia también han logrado cambios. Antes no podíamos hablar en nuestro idioma, no podíamos ejercer nuestra espiritualidad, no podíamos utilizar nuestra indumentaria. Actualmente sí lo podemos hacer. Hay otras formas de invasión que han llegado en nuestros territorios, esa extracción del conocimiento. Existen como muchas realidades bien difíciles, pero también seguimos resistiendo, seguimos evidenciando estas situaciones y seguimos elevando esa voz. Considero también de que desde la colectiva Ixpop intentamos realizar estas reflexiones para seguir conociendo cuáles son esas realidades que viven las mujeres en los diferentes territorios. En Guatemala somos 4 pueblos. Estamos los mayas, garífonas, chincas y mestizos, y de alguna forma quienes sufrimos más esas atrocidades de violaciones a nuestros derechos, hemos sido empobrecidos, hemos sido también principalmente las mujeres, las juventudes, las niñeces, porque también es importante pues nombrar esto que está pasando en nuestros territorios. Lamentablemente existe también mucho extractivismo. Ahorita pues probablemente el conflicto armado interno pues ya ha cesado. Sin embargo, pues vemos en nuestros territorios muchas mineras, mucho extractivismo, lo cual pues también está afectando. Y vemos ahorita la crisis climática que estamos viviendo, y esto no es más por lo que está pasando en nuestros territorios. También me gustaría como hacer énfasis en cómo pues las mujeres también han empezado a evidenciar esto. Tenemos un caso, por ejemplo, el caso Sepursarco, que son abuelas, ¿verdad? Quienes han posicionado también el tema de la violencia sexual durante el conflicto armado interno, y que en el año 2016 finalmente se tuvo una sentencia. O por ejemplo también las mujeres de caso Lote 8, que son mujeres quechís, quienes también han denunciado pues esa violación que está pasando en sus territorios, principalmente por la instalación de una minera en su territorio. Ellas fueron violadas por la policía privada de una minera y ellas también están exigiendo justicia porque no solamente están haciendo daño a la madre tierra, sino también a las mujeres, a las niñas, ¿verdad? También a través de la colectiva Ixpop intentamos acercar también estos instrumentos internacionales en los idiomas, porque también es importante hacerlos vivos, hacerlos dinámicos, y esto lo vamos a conseguir cuando la gente realmente pueda conocer sobre estos mecanismos, lo pueda entender desde su realidad, desde su propio contexto, porque a veces pues también existen como estas leyes internacionales, pero si no le damos una lectura más a lo interno de nuestras comunidades, pues esto puede ser como obsoleto, ¿verdad? Y lo que hemos intentado en la colectiva es que estos mecanismos puedan ser traducidos en los idiomas, ¿verdad? En Guatemala, pues predominan 4 idiomas. Hemos intentado acercar, ¿verdad? Porque es importante la CEDAW. Hemos intentado también acercar ahora la Recomendación General 39, porque a pesar de que intenta hablar de nuestros derechos, pues esto a veces no es reconocido cuando no es hablado en nuestro idioma, porque en nuestro idioma también tiene una connotación totalmente distinta y pues intentamos hacerlo, ¿verdad? Em, Compartirles que hemos intentado producir pues estos documentos, ¿verdad? Que acercan directamente pues estos mecanismos. También tenemos algunas a través de Spotify, ¿verdad? Que tenemos también como empezamos a hablar, digamos, de estos mecanismos para nosotras y esto pues ha ayudado bastante. Hemos intentado hacer como crear nuestras propias estrategias, ¿verdad? Y esto pues nos ha ayudado bastante también a hacer ejercicios de cómo nosotras podemos como recabar casos, intentarlo llevar también hacia el comité para que pueda ser también una visita oficial en Guatemala. Hasta ahorita pues o recientemente esto no se ha dado y creemos que es muy importante que el comité también pueda visitar el país para poder reconocer qué es lo que está pasando en nuestros territorios. Eso.
Muchas gracias. That's all I know. Sorry for my Espanol. I think when I think about Indigenous women and the legal system, I can't call it justice because there is no justice in the justice system for Indigenous women or probably for any woman, I would have to argue. Indigenous women always have to prove our rights. You know, you're talking about, we always have to go to court to prove our human rights. And that's what you can see here in Canada with the Indian Act that Amanda had mentioned earlier. And it was one of the UN mechanisms, I can't remember which committee exactly, that actually helped Indigenous women to regain our status kind of 1985. Because in Canada, the Indian Act still exists today. And I'm not sure how many people here know of the Indian Act. Maybe just a quick, yes, no, a little bit, just kind of to know how much I should talk about it. But it's, in Canada, it is a form of genocide because it impacts how we as women hand down our culture and our traditions to our children, our grandchildren's grandchildren. And as you spoke about how men are able to hand down through that patriarchal side, through the majority of Indigenous communities follow the matriarchal side. And the Indian Act, unfortunately, has been ingrained in our communities as connecting us to community because it's been around for so long. So even though we know it's this oppressive piece of legislation, it is now connected to our identity as Indigenous people. And so because of that, our ability, so for me as a First Nations woman, I can pass on my identity and my culture to my grandchildren. But that's where it stops. My grandchildren's grandchildren, unless they marry in another First Nations, that's where the line will stop. And so it doesn't mean that, we're no longer going to exist and we're going to continue to push and advocate. But when you think about resource extraction, you think about the environmental damage that's happening, there's a direct connection here, because if you no longer have Indians, and therefore you no longer have the Indian problem, and it's that kind of that colonization continuing, and you don't have to worry about lands-based rights and rights of inherent rights happening in the countries. So when you're looking at the legal system, and you look at how is it impacting Indigenous women today, so Indigenous women are being either overplaced or underplaced. So when you're talking about whether or not we believe Indigenous women and their experiences, you just have to look at, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and how that came from a grassroots movement. It came from Indigenous women's organizations who were unfunded to do this work, who did marches crying out for responses for people, for the legal system, justice systems, policing systems to search for their loved ones, to charge their perpetrator. And, so you kind of fast forward to, you have a national inquiry. And during this time, I was just looking at some stats this morning. Since the national inquiry's report, femicides against Indigenous women has continued to increase, and not any surprise. And then you look at the budget 2023, 24, I don't know what year we're in, the budget that was just recently passed. It's a good analysis tool for all the advocates here in the room. If you want to look at the value system of a country, analyze that budget as you're speaking about. Look at the budget for that country and search up keywords. That's what we do. We look at budget and we type in, search Indigenous women, or search women, search Black women, search, whatever your target, search disabilities, and see how many times that's referenced in that budget. Because we know that people value money within the countries. And so you can kind of see where that value system and how it's rolling out on prioritizing and addressing an issue. And so in this past budget, our analysis showed that the investments into Indigenous women are only once we've gone missing or we've been murdered. There is no investments into prevention. So they're investing into searching for the remains in Winnipeg from the serial killer that's happening down there finally. And those families have a right, and those women have a right to be recovered. And then you're looking at the other investment is around the red dress alert, which is for how we can coordinate as systems to help find somebody who's gone missing. Where's the investments into healing? Where's the investments into prevention? Where's the investments into Indigenous women and our agencies that we have a right to? When you're talking about General Recommendation 39, you're looking at, in Canada, we have the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And Canada has taken the UNDRIP and has implemented it through what's called a nation-to-nation policy. Nation-to-nation policy is within a very limited framing and scope, because they're only engaging with national Indigenous organizations. Not all agencies here in Canada are connected to a national Indigenous organizations. So you got to look at who's missing then. If this is the policy, who is missing from this engagement? Indigenous women on the ground in communities are missing. Indigenous women's organizations are missing from the conversation. How can you look at child welfare reform without talking to the mothers? You can't. You need to be able to look at having so many different perspectives, because that's where good public policy comes from. It comes from diverse perspectives. It comes from engaging with people who are affected by that policy. And when you're talking about sexual violence, you look at the Me Too campaign. It stopped, came to a brick wall, stopped in Indigenous communities. There was no Me Too movement within our communities. And why is that? So we're unpacking that as an organization. We started to engage around doing a research project to engage with Indigenous women around why did it stop, and what can we do to address the level of sexual violence that's happening in our communities? Because as Amanda was saying, we engaged with and worked directly with, for instance, survivors of human trafficking. We have the largest Indigenous anti-human trafficking program in Canada, and we did the largest engagement with survivors. And that forms the basis of our advocacy moving forward. And so they told us what they need and the gaps around that. And one part of it is uncovering the truth around sexual violence, that sexualization, the normalization of sexualizing Indigenous women. You just have to look at, you know, Halloween. You just have to look at those costumes and why is there such an uproar over, you know, an Indigenous woman, you know, being a sexualized costume, because that's normalizing violence. And that's why when you look at Indigenous women are more likely to be targeted for serial killers. And that's why, because there is a dehumanizing of us here in Canada that's still happening today. And so that's what we're doing to bring forward to CEDA and to these international spaces. We're bringing forward that truth because Canada is upheld to be such a kind of like an A+ country, investing into other women and their work going forward. But we have to still be there to continue to push that advocacy and to tell our truths and to tell and disrupt the systems here.
I just want. Is this working? Oh, amazing. I just wanted to say also, Cora, that the national inquiry itself was a recommendation of CEDA. And the first inquiry into missing and murdered women in Canada came from CEDA under its optional protocol, the power it has to go and investigate grave and systematic human rights violations of women in various countries. And Canada was investigated because of the work of Indigenous women advocating at the UN. And so I think it's sort of the untold story of how we got the national inquiry, that it was really the international mechanisms and the advocacy of Indigenous women in those international mechanisms that got the Canadian public to become aware of something that had been made invisible for decades, and was decades and decades of that advocacy that resulted in that. So all of us want to thank you for the work that went into that. I think if we can all just. Okay, we've reached that point in the evening where we're making space for questions. And I know that we have a large group of participants in the Women's Human Rights Institute who've been learning about these contexts and sharing from their contexts. These are senior advocates that are working all around the world on women's human rights. And I know that some of you will have questions and conversations you want to have with the panel. And I'm also aware that we have with us a treasure of reflection on how women's international human rights got to be human rights and the connection with violence against women and the kinds of stories that you've been hearing for decades, Alda, on why we need these mechanisms to support us in our advocacy. And I wondered if there was anything you wanted to reflect on that you've heard from these amazing panelists so far.
Good evening or afternoon, whatever it is. I'm not clear, but it's been just listening to the three panelists and our moderator. I've thought so much of how we have to really keep how the Women's Human Rights Institute is on the right track of trying to get the more women to know about CEDA and the other mechanisms that women can use, not only to get, take a case to the UN but to amplify women's voices. All kinds of women, all women are covered under CEDA. That's what I always say, and it really is important because when we started with asking for a general recommendation for CEDA on Indigenous women, we said, imagine if there's all these Indigenous women plus all the women that also are allies to the Indigenous women, and it's a big movement, and we have to think that way. That the important voices are the Indigenous women in this case of General Recommendation 39, but all the allies that are needed and do amplify the voices of people that are in the public, in radio programs, TV programs that can talk about this. And I just want to say that it's very important also to know the difference between going to CEDA and our great committee member here And CEDAW really listens to women, Rita, which is different when you go to a Beijing conference or when you go to all these things. It's not the same. CEDAW is really listening to women and trying to get in UN language, what we call UNEs, to translate the voices of women, that every time there's a general recommendation, women have talked about what their interests are, and it put it in UN language so that the whole world can understand it. But then it's our responsibility in each country and in each community to translate that so that women in our communities can understand. We have to do the work. The UN can't do everything. Can't talk in the languages, how many thousands and thousands of languages there are around the world. We have to do the work. And that's why I admire Ixpop and Sadita so much, because they really are doing the work of translating General Recommendation 39 to their communities so that women can identify you're welcome to come and after see what they've done with General Recommendation 39. They put it in women with their how do you say it in English? The atuendos? How do you say it? Well, the traditional dresses, they wear there so that the women can identify, this is about me. This is about our rights. And it's so fantastic to see their faces getting so illuminated when they see that they have rights, and somebody in Geneva agreed to that they have right, and we're helping them. They feel supported in that this is reality. And one more thing, and I will stop so that you can ask questions to the panelists, is that the context, as all of you mentioned, that to talk about the context, that's something that CEDAW always does, right? And that is the important thing, because that's why they listen to the women from each country that is reporting, and in each of the different NGOs that present to the CEDAW committee, listen and see. They know now what is the context, because they have the official version of what's happening in the country and the civil society version of what's happening in the country, and they really do a great job. I've been following CEDAW for the past 40 years. And so I really, really know that this work is, and that's why I try to get more people involved in really working, because if we imagine if all women around the world got together to end patriarchy and to end violence, because violence hasn't ended because we still haven't gotten equality. While we're living in patriarchal societies, we're never going to end violence against women. So the fight has to be to end patriarchy. And patriarchy is always colonial. It's always anti-life. And it's always necrophilic, which I always say that it is a system that is about destroying life and destroying the planet. So if we unite, we can really do something to end violence and patriarchy so that we can end violence.
I'm going to invite folks who have questions of any or all of the panelists to ask their questions. We also have people online. We have 90 people online, I believe, who may send their questions to either Bafia or Angela. And we'll just take a moment. I also really want to thank Michael, who's in the back translating rapidly. And we have someone online translating also. Carissa, thank you, Carissa. You and Michael are the glue that makes sure that women around the world can speak to each other. So thank you. And I also want to add, which I should have said at the beginning, we should speak a bit more slowly so that our translators have a chance of following. It's very hard work because this is not scripted, and they have to do it simultaneously. So thank you. Do we have some questions online you want to pass over? Do you want a microphone? I have equipment on my lap, so standing up is maybe dangerous.
So I'll read out the two questions and then pass it back to the panel. The first question is, What opportunities do you see for Indigenous women's networks and organizations to create and implement an action plan for implementing CEDAW General Recommendation 39? The next question. Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot to remember.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you want to go?
Sure. Maybe both of us? Yeah. You want to go? Yeah, this is actually one of our recommendations coming up for CEDA. So really being able to look at the implementation now. So we do have the General Recommendation 39 now. It's about looking at the action towards it. And in particular, looking at the implementation, where, you know, here in Canada, we're seeing from some of the reports that the state is submitting, they're using a lot of federalism as an excuse for inaction. Looking at, you know, but we know violence doesn't have jurisdictional bounds. Like we know that we can't have jurisdictional issues around the implementation and being able to state, you know, for instance, General Recommendation 39 speaks to Indigenous women having a right to their own agency. Indigenous women have a right to their own voice. And here in Canada, we need to take that into the context of nation-to-nation policy that actually excludes our voice, excludes our agencies from those conversations. And so now we're really pushing for a nation-to-nation plus approach. We're saying, yes, those political organizations are needed, but so is the urban Indigenous community, so are Indigenous women. And we can't use federalism as an excuse for inaction. And so I do believe that this is one of the recommendations we're looking at forward on how can we get to hold states accountable for the implementation of these recommendations and for their action plan. I'm not sure if you have anything else to add.
Bueno, me parece una pregunta muy, muy importante, principalmente porque necesitamos seguir creando redes, necesitamos seguir cohesionándonos como mujeres. Nosotras como Colectiva Ixpop hemos empezado a crear una red en Guatemala principalmente para dar a conocer esta recomendación general. Creemos que esto es un reto muy grande porque ahora ya tenemos la recomendación, pero ¿qué hacemos con ello? ¿Cómo profundizamos su aplicación? ¿Cómo exigimos a que realmente esto se cumpla? Este es un gran reto que tenemos y considero que en Guatemala pues hemos empezado a crear esta red para poder hablar sobre esta recomendación. Hemos incluido en esta red a niñas, a jóvenes, a mujeres adultas, a mujeres académicas, a mujeres lideresas de las comunidades, porque creemos que ese intercambio de conocimiento puede ayudar. A través de ese intercambio de conocimiento, pues también podemos aprender sobre las realidades que vive cada una de estas mujeres indígenas. También hemos hecho ejercicios para poder conocer esa diversidad de mujeres indígenas que habemos. También conocer esa vivencia particular, porque no es lo mismo de lo que viven el tipo de violencia cuando son mujeres con alguna discapacidad, cuando son mujeres indígenas que probablemente tengan VIH, o las mujeres indígenas que probablemente nunca han estado en una escuela. Hay diversidad de mujeres indígenas y por lo tanto pues aterrizar esta recomendación general a esa realidad pues ayuda muchísimo. También hemos visto de que varias organizaciones a nivel global, organizaciones con una presencia más grande, también han tomado la recomendación general. Y eso pues es bastante importante porque así vamos apoyándonos como mujeres indígenas a conocer sobre nuestros derechos. Sabemos de que esa resistencia pues ha permanecido porque los pueblos hemos sido así, hemos luchado constantemente y esto solamente viene a sumar a algo que hemos venido trabajando de generación en generación. También considero que esta es una gran oportunidad y es estratégico de cómo el instituto está promoviendo estas sesiones para que también podamos interconectar. Habemos 15 países, ¿verdad?, en este espacio. Y creo que es bastante importante pues poder crear esta red porque probablemente en sus países también hay pueblos indígenas y por lo tanto acercarnos y crear este mecanismo que nos ayude luego a reflejar lo que está pasando ante el comité, ante Naciones Unidas, pues también va a fortalecer nuestros derechos.
Thank you so much. Angela, would you like to give us the second question?
National Action Plan. All right. Thank you to both Sarah and Cora for their responses to this issue of a national action plan. And I just want to say that sitting on the CDOC committee, this is a recommendation that we make for implementation of general recommendations and other policies. And so I think that initially, let's take Canada, for example, that's going to be appearing before the CDOC committee in October, would really need to think about creating a national action plan for the implementation of GR 39. And it seems as though a policy needs to be established around it, you know, governmental policy. And I understand what you're saying, Cora, that the government will use the issue of federalism and how that then interfaces with the provinces, et cetera. But I think where the CDOC committee sits on this issue of federalism versus the provincial governments is that the Canadian state has ratified the convention and is accountable under the convention to do what is necessary to implement GR 39. And so speaking of federalism is not a way out. It is actually, you know, they're accountable as the federalist government to do what they're supposed to do and implement, and the obligations are on the Canadian state. So they have to find a mechanism to make that happen with the provinces. And so I think that is really one of the ways that we can work with GR 39. And it's really good to hear from you, Sarah, that you've already begun to work with the GR 39 in your communities in the different women's constituencies. And so there are obviously ways to do it like that. And I think a way forward is for Guatemala to really create a national plan, also an action plan that has time-bound indicators of progress and that has built into it certain assessments of impact of what they're trying to do, because you will have legislation that needs to happen. You'll need programs that need to be implemented. A budget has to be created for all of this. And so a policy position by the government and a roadmap through a national action plan is absolutely critical. And that is what we would advocate on the CDOC committee.
We have some friends whose ears are perking up while we're having this conversation. So thank you for that clarification. Angela, you have another question, I believe, online. We have a question here. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. My name is Jennifer Keeling. I'm the Deputy Director in the Human Rights and Indigenous Affairs Policy Team at Global Affairs Canada. So I'm one of the ones whose ears perked up when the question and conversation you were just having. But my question today, I think, is for anyone who wants to answer it. And I apologize if it's a bit clumsy, as I'm still kind of working out exactly what I'm trying to get at here. But what I think you've talked a bit about the dissonance between what happens sort of at the UN level and the international level and kind of what happens at the community level. And my question is sort of in this space as well, how we kind of bridge a bit of that, but also taking into account the backlash that the anti-rights movement, the anti-gender movement, and how do we kind of, you know, in our work on a day-to-day basis is focused on trying to get progressive language in a resolution to make sure that we're maintaining the standards, the international standards that are agreed upon in these documents, really trying to combat a lot of countries who are trying to undermine that, and understanding that that is happening at community and local levels as well. And so I think my question that I'm getting to, I promise, is how are some of the work that you're doing both connecting to, Sarah, you're talking about the amazing work you're doing to connect with making CEDAW relevant, bringing it to life, and then can you talk a bit about the challenges in the context of a really growing anti-rights, growing anti-gender movement that is also happening in local communities? I hope that makes sense. That's what I'm sort of thinking about.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think a number of us will have responses to that, and you've asked something specific also of Sarah, but I have the microphone, so I'm going to offer a partial answer before I hand the mic over to others. One of the obligations of the state under CEDAW is to educate on the rights that are inherent in CEDAW. And I think that's one of the things that we in Canada haven't done as well. I was really energized by what happened, for instance, in Bangladesh. When Bangladesh was appearing before CEDAW, they actually had television screens in villages, and people were excited. I mean, it's a different context, but it was, to me, an indication that, Bangladesh is at the UN. This is a thing. It's important. It's a moment. And here we are reporting on what we're doing on women's human rights. Obviously, that particular method wouldn't work in Canada, but I think there are ways for us to get behind what we're doing with women's international human rights in a way that can be energizing. We've been talking here. I mean, we're here at the Human Rights Research and Education Center. And so we believe strongly in human rights education, and there are institutes all over Canada and all over the world that do that work. And I think there's really room for a partnership on designing education on human rights. And to me, it's more shocking, perhaps, that Canada and Canadians don't know about those rights because of the roles we play internationally. And the Women's Human Rights Institute is obviously one of the mechanisms by which, in particular, women's human rights become something that people get access to. And you see a room full of people who are alumna of, previous programs who've taken that up in their own countries, including within Canada. And I think there are lots of places in civil society and educational institutions where there's knowledge about how to educate on human rights, and that we could take that up. And it could be for younger kids as well. It can be in curriculum. It can be designed so that people are growing up with that knowledge, and we're not waiting until somebody tells them that it's their right, to drive a truck into Ottawa and honk the horn for 48 hours. And that's what rights mean. We get to seize that agenda and explain what rights really are and what they aren't. Alda asked me, why wouldn't it work to have a TV in a village? Just because the context is a little bit different. People don't actually go. It's freezing cold here for most of the year. Like, speaking of Ottawa, it's 11 months of winter. So people don't gather in the same way as they would in a village common. There isn't one place. Great if we could get onto the sports channel and we could have instead of sports bars, we could have human rights bars. Can you imagine? Finally, I'm like the other kids, Mom. But you get the idea.
Muy bien. Bueno, me parece una pregunta bastante retadora, principalmente para los contextos centroamericanos o principalmente el de Guatemala. en donde está cobrando mucha vida y mucha fuerza las personas, organizaciones antiderechos humanos, ¿verdad? Lamentablemente pareciera que ellos sí tienen una agenda y nosotras no contamos con esa agenda estratégica, ¿verdad? Igual considero que sumado a esto, también en Guatemala es muy fuerte el tema del racismo, ¿verdad? Porque aunado a todo esto, pues también está el racismo inmerso, el racismo que probablemente a veces es muy evidente, ¿verdad? Principalmente porque las mujeres indígenas o pueblos indígenas intentan también tomar acción en Guatemala y eso pues no les gusta. Lamentablemente pues Guatemala ha sido em, uno de estos países en donde hemos visto de que el fundamentalismo está muy inmerso, ¿verdad? En la religión, en la política, a nivel social, o sea, esto es bastante fuerte. Sin embargo, pues también nosotras consideramos que el tener una formación política nos ayuda, ¿verdad? Una formación política que haga valer también nuestro derecho, que haga valer también nuestras propias formas de organización a nivel comunitario. También necesitamos, ¿verdad? Seguir como impulsando acciones que realmente dé a conocer las situaciones de violencia que vivimos. Cuando hablamos nosotras de interseccionalidad, intentamos también como recoger realmente esas vivencias, ¿verdad? De las mujeres. Em, y cómo nosotras intentamos también acercarnos ante estos mecanismos es a través de estas realidades que vivimos. Por ejemplo, en el 2017 fue que quemaron algunas niñas en un hogar seguro, así se le llama, en donde a estas niñas y adolescentes que estaban bajo el resguardo del Estado, pues fueron vulneradas y fueron quemadas, ¿verdad? Intentamos nosotras como hacer esa investigación y elevarlo también ante el comité para que el mismo comité se dé cuenta de esas realidades que viven las mujeres. Y creo que esto al final es un puente, ¿verdad?, entre lo que sucede en los territorios, lo que sucede en los países, para que el sistema de Naciones Unidas pues también pueda seguir creando mecanismos para la defensa de los derechos individuales y colectivos. No solamente es este caso, sino hay muchos más, ¿verdad? Constantemente vemos que existe esa violencia sistemática y sí quisiera como poner en evidencia que ante todo esto, pues también ese racismo que está muy fuerte y nosotras por eso intentamos también a través de la CEDAW hacer evidente estas situaciones y por eso fue que empezamos a ver como una pequeña luz, una pequeña ventana a través de la recomendación general, porque creemos que ahí puede recoger también nuestras vivencias, sino ver estos mecanismos lejanos de nosotras, lejano de nuestras realidades, sino más bien que pueda existir esa ventana como una oportunidad para poder dar a conocer nuestras realidades.
Laura, you wanted to say something? So we're shortly going to be closing. I want to give the last word to Cora, and then we're going to invite you to come out in the hallway and celebrate our 20th anniversary with us, and enjoy the rest of the evening and continue these conversations more informally. Thank you. Cora.
Nicolette, great question. Nice to see you. I think what Canada needs to look at is looking at investing into human rights defenders, into our mobilization in order to balance the narrative. Because we are seeing this happen. Like when we were in New York, we did have infiltration of, this kind of polarization of happening into these spaces. And so we really need to look at, if we want to systemically address this, we need to have investments into those who have not been invested for us to have the capacity to address this, because what we are seeing is that these kind of, sorry, this little fruit fly around here. what we are seeing is that they have the resources and funding to mobilize their story and what's happening. So we really need to look at counter it through investments into Indigenous women's organizations, into human rights defenders, into those that are doing this work. Because if we don't have those sustainable investments and those foundations in order for us to continue to do this work, we're coming up, we already are up against so many systemic barriers, and to continue to have barrier after barrier after barrier, what we need is states to help counteract some of those barriers by investing into those that can do this fight. And it's also about then the opportunity is for us to look at how we bring everyone into the circle, because people think that when you focus in on and empower a community, when you're empowering women, when you're empowering Indigenous women, you're taken away from them. And so that's like the education part that needs to come in. When we have to look at where is there like healing supports here in Canada. And I think coming out of the pandemic, I think people are not well. Like the mental health and addiction crisis and issues, like we're not well. Like the fastest growing, kind of AI growth because of the pandemic, and the narrative and the control that AI has is all playing into what we're seeing. So, and I think it's just because if we don't have, because I work on the front line as well here in Canada, we don't have comprehensive healing. So if you are dealing with an addiction issue, you can't get access to treatment services unless you have $30,000 to $60,000 sitting in your bank account if you need access to treatment tomorrow. And so because there is such a long wait list. So we really have to start to look at, investing in the community, and those investments need to include healing. We need comprehensive healing as a community, and we need investments for the human rights defenders. Language.
Well, thank you so much for such a brilliant conversation. I know everybody wants the conversation to go on, and so it will. We'll step outside, just outside here. We have hopefully got catering out there. I've been in here, so I don't know if they arrived. I'm hoping they did. We have some tables set up, and we have Birch Bite catering from an Algonquin caterer from up where I live in Masham area. And please enjoy. And we're going to say a few words formally. Once we get out into the foyer, if you can put up with a little bit more of us talking, and then we're going to enjoy some bites, some appetizers, and some more informal conversations. Well, thank you so much for coming out.